All right, everybody, thanks for being here. I'm Andrea Moore, and I was one of the instructors for the OPL 525 Introduction to E-Learning course. I'm just so humbled and honored to be able to present Ruth Clark. I've actually, through our link in ISPI, International Society for Performance Improvement, I have been able to introduce her two other times. Once she won the Gilbert Award back in, I think, 2004. And then she won another award in 2006, and I can't remember if it was Member for Life or something, Ruth? I don't remember which.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's way beyond my time. I don't remember either.
Okay, well, in any case, I had the honor. I was on the ISPI executive board, so I had the honor of introducing her. And in one of the introductions, we played a Ruth Clark trivia game, and it was really funny because we have a ringer in the audience, which was Allison Rossett, which maybe you are familiar with that name. First Things Fast, I think, is her landmark book. But in any case, I want to hand it over to Ruth. She's going to say some stuff about her background, but it's just, I can't even explain how happy and excited I am to have her with us today. So take it away, Ruth.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. And I'm going to be fairly brief today. My main goal is to work in the interest maybe of some research literacy, because it's fun to read books like this and you have these principles and you have little summaries, but what you don't really have is the original research. And I think all of us as practitioners, it's important, not only to, look at the guidelines and see summaries of evidence, but to be able to read evidence and to look at it and to say, well, does this apply to me or does it not apply? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? So basically what I have done in my career, I call myself a translator, because what I've tried to do, I think most practitioners don't have the time to go back and read a lot of original research, and some of it is not applicable and some of it is. So what I've done is to review a certain number of journals every month, every 2 or 3 months, and then I find something that seems relevant and then review them and then try to interpret and integrate them and to illustrate them with examples, from workforce learning. So workforce learning has been my main focus, and evidence-based practice. So I'm basically, 90% retired now and just doing a little bit of writing and occasional webinars and having fun. So this is for workforce learning, and you can just take a guess on this, and Andrea will have to tell me what the guesses are. But, how much did we invest? This is workforce learning, and the latest data we have is 2016. How much per employee do you think in a year? And you can choose A, B, C, or D, and Andre will kind of tell me what you think.
So right now, we've got 3 folks saying C, Ruth, and 1 person saying B.
Okay, good. So we have a conservative spender, and the rest of you, you're just about right on there. The actual amount was about almost $1,300. And I think what's interesting, ATD publishes this every year at the end of the year. And what's interesting is you look at it over time, except for our recession year, you can see we've had steady growth. And if you multiply this out probably by the number of employees, you'd be somewhere in the $50 billion range. So the point is we make a heavy and continually greater investment in workforce learning every year. And the question is, what's the return on investment? Do we know what we get for that? And when I ask practitioners this, frankly, there's not a lot of level 3 and level 4 evaluation. So generally, we don't know exactly what we're getting. But I always suggest, at least if you're using evidence-based practice, there's a higher probability that you are getting a return on investment because you're using methods that have been looked at and proven scientifically. So what is evidence-based training? This is a little definition, and it's, I think, the same one that's in the book. Basically judicious, so by that I mean, there's not evidence for everything, and we can't base everything on just evidence. So we use it where it makes sense, and then where it doesn't, we extend beyond. current best evidence. So the article I sent out for you is a very recent article, and it's actually adding a little piece of knowledge to what we know about pedagogical agents. So research evolves. And what's the point of this research? Well, we're making decisions, but not necessarily about training, but what we really want to do is optimize our organizational goals, which may or may not be training, but in the case of this literature, it's mostly going to relate to some kind of training. So that's my definition of evidence-based practice. I think there's different kinds of evidence. So I like to show this practitioner evidence, which if you've worked in organizations, you probably have been engaged in data collection in one or more of these. For example, you've done a needs assessment or performance analysis. Maybe you've done prototype testing. You've probably done some kind of evaluation. So with practitioner evidence, typically it's not real rigorous in terms of scientific control or in terms sometimes of the statistical analysis, but you're still collecting data, which is going to help you make some decisions. But that's not what we're going to look at here. What I have done in my books is to try to summarize what I'm calling academic evidence, and that's because the majority of it does come from research universities. And this is varied, the academic evidence. You can see it on the screen. I tend to emphasize experiments. Factorial experiments, which is just another type of experiment. Sometimes we have correlational studies. I'm happy to see more and more meta-analysis, which I would classify as a synthesis. And then more and more we're starting to see psychological mediators, which you did see in this article. It was one of the reasons I wanted to share that particular article with you, because they did eye tracking. So that's the focus of the book and my work, academic evidence. So my hero is Rich Mayer. And if you took a look at the book, I would say 80% of the research is Rich Mayer's research. The first half of the book, maybe the first 7 or 8 chapters, are almost completely based on his evidence. And then the last half of the book involves other questions that he has not addressed specifically. And you may recognize some of these principles from the chapters you read, his multimedia, coherence, modality, etc. I was just looking him up yesterday, and on his website, he has had over 500 publications. For a number of years, he was the #1, most published research educational psychologist in the world. And among all those 500 publications, over 30 of them were books, either original books that he wrote, or he co-authored, or he edited. So Rich Mayer is a very prolific person, and I was a science major undergraduate, so his basic thing is experimental research, which I really like, because I was a science major too. So in my webinars, I usually do start with this question. And I'm just going to ask you, if you have a preferred learning style, I'd like you to type into chat. There's different kinds of learning styles, we know that. But one common one is called visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. You've probably heard of it. And I'm wondering if you have a thought, and you can use chat, which is your preferred style. You can put in A, B, C, or a comment. So I'm going to pause a minute and let you type something into chat about your learning style.
Boy, Ruth, it's a mixed bag.
Okay, tell me some of what you got.
I've got responses for all 3 from different folks.
Okay. So we have a variety here. So let's look at the evidence about learning styles. This is a research study that was done, as you can see, in 2006. And what they did, they had 60 students, and they did 3 things. Each student did all 3. They did a self-report, which you just did. Then they took us tests. There's a lot of learning style tests. This particular one was the Barsh learning style. And then they had 3 memory tests, which you did all 3. One was a visual test where you looked at a picture and then they took it away and you had to reproduce it. One was auditory, where you listened to a paragraph and then you tried to reproduce that. The tactile test was fun. You were blindfolded and you had to feel these, like maybe 12 puzzle pieces, and then they mixed in a whole lot of other pieces and you were supposed to try to pick them out, but again without the use of visuals. So everybody did all 3 of these tests, and then the idea is they wanted to see, well, what's the correlation among these different tests? So for example, if you said, okay, A, I'm a visual learner, then you should have scored higher on the visual part of this learning style test, and your memory would have been a little better for the visual data rather than auditory or tactile. So my question for you is, what do you think was the correlation among these tests? Was it high, low, or zero? So type into chat, what do you think?
Got one response that was said the correlation was low. Another response says, since learners don't gauge their knowledge very well in terms of competence, it might be the same with learning styles.
Sorry, Andrea, just to jump in quickly, that was also me. I said I thought it was low because I do remember reading that when learners are asked to evaluate their own competence and then take an assessment, I just remember reading that they don't tend to accurately assess themselves. So I figured it might be the same with learning styles.
Okay, and then the one that I was chuckling about was from Riley. Riley, do you want to tell Ruth what you said in the chat?
Yeah, no, I've read your works on this, so I already know the answer.
Woo, good.
It's a trick question.
Right. So what's the answer?
That's funny.
Yeah, the correct answer is that there is no relationship, and this idea of learning styles is kind of a myth. There's actual evidence that shows that certain presentations of learning is actually better than others, regardless of what people self-identify as. Am I correct?
Thank you. Absolutely. You did a great job with that and saved me my teaching point, which I'm very happy that you got that, because I think in almost all of my books and things, I bring this up, and I bring it up as one of those really ingrained myths that's widely held. When I do this now with practitioners who haven't studied like you guys have, usually, everybody is a lot of companies and organizations, they are invested in this, or psychologically invested in this whole idea of learning styles, for which we have absolutely no evidence. None of the studies have shown that, at least in this particular type of learning style, that there's any validity to it. And yet organizations are spending a lot of time and money trying to accommodate, for example, a visual learner and auditory learner. And as you can recall from Rich Mayer's research, we all know that visuals can be effective, some visuals for some people some of the time, and that they're better if they're complex, explained by audio, et cetera, et cetera. So I just always start my presentations with the idea of this very pervasive, compelling myth that is actually causing a lot of wasted time and money. And as a little argument for, let's instead look at what the research tells us and base our decisions on that. I'll see if there's anyone wants to come in on audio or chat with any additional comments about learning styles. So I'm not hearing anything, which is fine. What I want to suggest is, instead of things like learning styles, we look to experimental evidence. Experiments, being a science major, were my preferred method, and you guys can all remember from your science classes, a valid experiment, you're going to have a certain number of students for statistical power, at least 50 to 60. You're going to randomly assign them to 2 or more treatments. So in my simple example here, one is text only, the other one is the same text, but now we've added a graphic. And then all of those students take the same test. We calculate averages and probabilities and effect sizes, etc. So we know experimental evidence is, one of the best ways of determining what instructional methods work most effectively. And it's hard to do those experiments, out in the practitioner world, to get controls and random assignment and all the rest of it, which is why, we rely on a lot of university research for this. But there's no perfect research. You're going to find all research has its strengths and weaknesses. And I always look at it from an eye of, does this apply for me as a practitioner? Here's some of the limits that I see in a lot of the original research studies. First of all, being in universities, most of the professors and most of these studies are based on college students. So we actually know a lot about younger learners. We know very little about older people like me. Secondly, up until recently, and if you read the pre-reading, you see that I'm very pleased to see an exception, but mostly the research has been done in the United States, Australia, or Europe. So we've had a lot of Western learners. I would like to think that these basic principles would apply regardless of culture, but it's good to actually see that's the case. The majority of these, you do the treatment, and then students are tested right away. So what would they be like in a week or a month? We don't usually know that. The lessons tend to be short. Up until recently, the majority of these used recall tests, which to me were relatively not so relevant, a recall test. And I always look for transfer tests because in, organizations, we're interested in people transferring to the job. And just because you can memorize something doesn't necessarily mean that you can apply it. And then content, you can imagine if you're doing an experiment, you want to have a relatively clean outcome that can be measured. So there's a lot of math and science in most of these. You can imagine math, that's so easy, it's pretty clear cut, usually right or wrong. One of my favorite studies ever actually used interviewing skills, and I was so thrilled. But that was a big job. The test was a role play test, and you had to have a rubric, and you had to, do little role plays and things. But I was so impressed that somebody actually did a soft skill, but that's pretty rare. So what I wanted to do for today was to have you look, and maybe you've looked at other original research studies. This is the one I set out. It's related to the personalization principle. I can't remember what chapter it's in, 6, 7, or 8, somewhere in there. And then particularly agents, pedagogical agents, and what role they might play. And so you can see Rich Mayer is on there with these other folks who I assume are probably his students. So in this research, just as a quick review, actually were 3 experiments. The first one was very simple. It had a gesturing agent in one lesson, and the comparison control lesson had no agents and no gestures, and they compared the results. The second experiment actually had 4 treatments, and that's the one I'm going to review a little bit here. 2 of them had agents, a gesturing and a non-gesturing agent. The second one had no agent with a gesture, which was just the little hand or no gesture. And then the last one, all the treatments had agents. And then they just wanted to see if the gesturing basically was acting as a signal. So they added a color signal to some of them. So anyway, looking at experiment 2, this is just taken from the article. These were the 4 treatments. This is some kind of neurological science lesson. And you can see we had the agent with and without a gesture on the top. And then on the bottom, we had a gesture, but the agent's cut off. And then the control was really no agent and no gesture. So we had like a 2-by-2 experiment here. Okay, so then they gave the results. They had 3 different types of tests, if you recall. They had a recall, a multiple choice, and a transfer. For the purposes of the book and for us here, I always just go to the transfer results. I usually kind of ignore because there's not necessarily a correlation between recall and application. So this is the transfer test. I just made a bar chart out of it. And I think the highest score they could have gotten was 17, but as you can see, they were pretty low. And what we really can conclude from this is the treatment that had the agent that was gesturing, learning was better compared to all the other treatments. So having an agent was good, but that agent needs to be serving some useful purpose. The cool thing I liked about this research was they also did eye tracking studies. So they plotted out these various key visual areas in the narration. And then for each one, they measured fixation time, fixation count, and average fixation. So I can imagine this is a lot of work, but the idea is to try to correlate, the visual attention with the learning and with the treatments. So that was just by way of a quick review of this little reading I sent you. So I'm going to give you an assignment now. Thinking about that research, thinking about how this may or may not apply well to a practitioner environment, I'd like you to first use the chat and list out at least 3 different features that were maybe most relevant or effective or applicable to practitioners. So I'll give you a minute to think about that and write them out. And Andrea will tell me what you come up with.
Ruth, there was a question while you were talking, and can I ask that to you right now? It's from Belen.
Sure.
Are recall and retention considered the same thing? That was the word used in the paper, retention test and transfer, and she just wants clarification.
I think that's a really good question. So what I always do is, in a good research report, they should describe in detail the assessments. And retention could mean like a multiple choice, identification type of test, but just identification of what was already presented, or it could be a complete recall. So the word retention, I always like to look a little deeper and see what was the experiment. And in this case, it was they gave them like a little problem or a little, situation about this neurological thing, and they had to actually type out, they had to actually recall what was presented. So it's a good question, and I would always dig a little deeper when I hear retention, but it's going to be remember level, either recognition or recall. Thanks, Andrea.
One other thing too that I was wondering about too, they in the article they called it matching, and you call it transfer, but you're talking about.
No, that was actually a separate test. So they did 3 tests.
Okay.
One was a recall.
Yes.
And one was a matching, which I kind of ignored both of those. And then another one was a transfer test. And they describe it. I'm looking here at the research in front of me. They describe that transfer test in the article. I'm looking for it. Maybe learning outcome, retention, transfer, and matching. So retention was to write down, so that was a recall, really. 22 points, blah, blah, blah. Transfer tests, 5 open-ended questions examining to what extent learners applied the learning knowledge to novel problems.
I see.
So that was the transfer, and that was the only data that I considered, and normally that's the case for the book as well. I just look at the transfer data.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Okay. So now let's write down the features that Ruth requested, and you can go ahead and put it in chat, and I can report back out. So.
Yeah, and by this I mean features that particularly make it relevant for application in an organizational workforce learning environment.
Okay, there's a clarification too, Ruth.
Uh-huh.
So the question is, what are some effective features of this research that would apply to, our program here at Boise State?
Or actually that would apply to anybody who's working in a workforce learning or, a government organization.
Anything related to learning, right?
Yeah, but for example, if it involved kindergartners, that probably wouldn't be so effective for our purposes.
Right.
There's no really right answer to this. It's kind of what you saw as, relevant to your environment.
Okay, thanks. It says, well, like Ruth mentioned in the beginning, it's important to build evidence-based practice, especially with the emergence of new technologies like e-learning and technologies to assess psychological mediators like eye tracking. That was from Belen.
Good.
And then Riley says, one question that came to my mind is, does this research actually support that instructor-led classroom training might be more effective than traditional e-learning? Would be interesting for me to see the same test done with an actual instructor in the classroom to see if the results correlated. That's interesting too.
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, this research didn't test that at all. But I do think they have done research on that where they used a video of an instructor compared to an online agent, which I don't have the results in front of me, but I think that has been looked at. And it's a good question. And my guess is, from the media research that if you're using basically the same methods, the results would be, if you're doing exactly the same thing, you'd get equivalent results. But instructors always have a lot of additional tricks they can use, right? So it's hard. That's why they use a video usually of an instructor. So you really are comparing apples to apples.
Well, it seems to me, Ruth, that an effective feature of research is the fact that practitioners can apply the results of people in academia who are basically doing the legwork on these studies.
That's right, Andrea. And that's why I say it's so important to look at the fine print because, for example, there is a lot of research with first graders, second graders, And I don't really include that because I think that whole thing, results may not apply to us in workforce learning. So I'm going to have my list up here, and you can see if this was, any of your same ideas. For one thing, of course, it being experimental, it was controlled and there was random assignment. So right there, I'm happy camper. They had a transfer test. A lot of research, when you look at how they tested and evaluated, it might be just recall. So again, that doesn't make me feel good because we need more than recall. The third thing one of you guys mentioned, the fact that they included eye tracking, so they're trying to look not only at learning, but the psychology behind it. I was thrilled to see that they had Chinese learners. These were Chinese university students because almost all the research before this has been Western culture. So you had 3 studies, and at least the first 2 were replications. So it's good to see that, and that's a characteristic of Mayer's research. He usually has at least 2, sometimes 3 experiments, which essentially replicate one another. If you read through all those hypotheses, each one kind of builds. So you're kind of going from one to the next and learning more. Something I love as an instructor and an author, he actually showed examples. A lot of times they don't. You could actually see what the treatments look like. They usually just describe them. And finally, we had relative adults in quotes maybe, these were university students, but still, it's better than kindergarten. So those were just some of the things that I saw that said, yeah, I think a lot of this would apply to my practice in some kind of adult learning setting. Let's see if anybody has any comments or anything to add.
One thing Belen is saying, and I think I know the answer to this question based on the article, can the research be replicated for further study with a larger, more diverse sample, since it was all mostly women and all Chinese folks? And I recall that in the article, there are 5 future things that Mayer said could happen, and those are basically further research and studies in this same area, though, with differing some part of the population or some personality effect, or not personality, but some trait of the individuals who participated.
You're absolutely right, and it was a really good question. At the end of articles, and it depends on the journal they're in, but most articles now are requiring a section at the end called limitations and future directions. And they essentially mention 3 here. One is, that this was college students, but we should also look at, different age groups, K through 12. Secondly, they mentioned it was all this, chemical synaptic transmission was the content. And so we need to see, would this be in other fields as well? And finally, prior knowledge. If you remember from the book, one individual factor that makes a big difference is prior knowledge. And this did not really have different prior knowledges. So it's a good question, and absolutely it should be replicated using different conditions. I agree. Anything else? Well, as I said earlier, there's no perfect research. So we have a pretty good list here of things that I thought made this a pretty relevant study, but there were, I thought, some things that did not make it a relevant study. And I'm going to look at the ones I came up with. So I'm going to talk about, well, I'll give you a minute to look at these and then briefly talk about them. First of all, in any experimental research, the test has to exceed what the students can do. In other words, if you have a really easy test, then you're not going to show any differences in your treatment. So then you have what they call a ceiling effect. So, but in learning, when we're trying to do in organizations, actually our goal is different. It's to actually get our learners all up to a high level of learning and a high criterion reference test. So this, in all experiments, is not going to be applicable completely to what we're trying to accomplish. Secondly, this is something else I always look at. How long were these lessons? These were like 2-minute lessons. So, in an experiment, you're going to, of course, be limited, but 2 minutes, is pretty short. Third, right after they took the lesson, they took the test. That's well and good, but more and more studies also will go back a week later, sometimes, 2 or 3 weeks later, just to see what kind of transfer do we have over time. And finally, by definition, as an experiment, it was a lab study. And if we had a number of replications, then the next step should be to, start to look at this in the classroom setting in a more naturalistic, realistic setting. It's complicated to do things in a classroom, but that would be the next steps once you have supported it in a lab setting. I'll see if anybody has any comments or questions about the limits, and maybe you saw some different limits that I didn't.
One thing, Ruth, if you wouldn't mind, I understand what criterion reference is, but I don't think I follow your comment about how the testing was not criterion reference.
Okay, so the transfer test that we looked at, the possible score on that was 17. And I think the highest score they had was like 7 or 8. So yes, if you have a really easy test, then you might get everybody scoring, let's say 12 or 13 or 14, then you don't see a difference in your treatments. So they always design a test that exceeds, probably everybody's capability to score well, which is not really what we do in business and industry. We try to evaluate the achievement of the learning objective, and we want everybody to be doing well. Does that make sense, Andrea?
Yeah, it does. It does now. Thank you.
It doesn't invalidate the results. It's just a real different kind of mentality from what we use.
Right.
Any other comments?
Riley wants to know, are there other studies using eye tracking that you know about?
There are. Yes. One of the studies that comes to mind, and I don't know if it's in your edition of the book. So Andrea and I have had a side discussion. I don't think you had the most recent edition, because eye tracking is relatively recent, but certainly in the last edition of the book. For example, you may remember the principle of contiguity, where if you have text and a picture, you want to have the text integrated close to the relevant parts of the picture. So they've done eye tracking on that. It was actually with a newspaper. I can't remember if it was in your edition or not. It was, it's memorable because it's in some like Norwegian or Swedish or something. But in one case, the pictures were split out from the text, and the other case, they were integrated. And they did eye tracking, and they had a diagram that showed when you had the pictures integrated, how your eye integrated the picture with the text versus if they were separated. So yes, it's relatively recent, but it's being done more and more, and in probably the last 2 or 3 years, you can see studies with eye tracking.
Terrific, thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, to sort of wrap up, where are we going? I'm hoping that we're going to see longer treatments. 2 minutes is pretty short. Even more important to me is, and I am seeing more and more of this, that the learning is measured not only immediately, but maybe at least a week or 2 weeks later. We're going to see a focus on boundary conditions. So I'm a bit happy that Rich Mayer's principles from the very first edition have not fundamentally changed, but what has changed is more understanding of under what conditions a particular instructional method might be effective. For example, graphics. We know not all graphics are equally effective. So what type of graphic is more effective for what kinds of learners and for what kind of goals? So I think we're going to see more nuanced application of the principles. And finally, as I mentioned before, we're going to need to follow up with actual naturalistic, kinds of studies. So that's where I hope we're going to see research going. And that basically concludes my little thoughts, and I hope that, this was helpful and interesting. Thanks, Andrea, for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure, Ruth, and it's very exciting that you're here with us. I just unmuted everybody, and so what do we have, about 10, 15 minutes for questions? Is that okay, Ruth?
Sure.
Mine is less of a question, more of a comment, just on that spatial contiguity principle. I found it interesting in the article that they actually looked at whether the PA was a seductive detail, and essentially it wasn't. They just familiarized themselves in the beginning, first like 8 seconds or something, with looking at the PA. But I did appreciate that they actually looked at that. And I think because the learning applied that contiguity principle, and because the PA was close enough with the gesturing that it wasn't a complete distraction, it clearly it was not a seductive detail.
Yes, I agree. That's a really good observation. And certainly in other studies, when they have had a PA just on the screen, not really doing anything functional, it did serve, learning was depressed, and it did serve as a distraction, seductive detail. But here, because the PA was functional, it didn't. So good comment and good observation.
The fact that just a PA on the screen might deter from learning, I mean, that's an eye-opener for me. So I was very shocked to hear that, because so many e-learning programs have that person who's just, you know, sitting there, basically not doing anything. And so that was very enlightening to me.
Yeah, you're right, Andrea. And Rich Mayer calls that the embodiment principle, which is
Right.
basically they can't just be there. They have to be doing something relevant.
And I believe that that was one of the hypotheses that they looked at, was the image hypothesis, to see whether having, you know, an animal, human, cartoon, the image alone was actually negligible to the learning. It didn't help, it didn't benefit the outcomes.
Right.
So perhaps one of my questions is kind of on a larger issue. You talk about laboratory type learning. It seems in today's, especially with e-learning, where it's mobile, where it's in a number of environments, once you get the motivation, the attention span, the ability just to click through things sometimes, it all seems to affect. Is there studies out there that shows how you can make compelling learning in any environment that the learner himself might or herself might be in?
That's a really good question. The whole area of motivation, and I'll be interested in Andrea's thoughts. And I did take it up with Rich Mayer, because you may have noticed we didn't discuss motivation in the book. And I think that's because there's no unified theory of motivation. It's a combination of things. My best answer to that is, I think if you make the learning environment relevant, and one of my favorite is scenario-based types of learning, where you are actually engaged in working through some job-relevant kinds of problems. For example, problem-based learning in medical education, you're going to tap into motivation more. But we certainly have a lot more to learn about, you know, motivation and the various features that will increase motivation without depressing learning at the same time. You saw the seductive detail research in the book, where, you know, maybe it was more, actually students liked it better, but the learning was worse.
Thank you. Maybe a follow-up question to that too. One of the things that I've struggled with, so for instance, at our work, we're working with a group of the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety. And they're in the middle of a 4-year research project on hazard identification in sand and gravel mines. And so they spent a tremendous amount, 3 years of research, including using eye tracking software to track where people's eyes gaze when they look for hazards and things. And anyway, they developed a learning module, an immersive learning module out of it that we're beta testing for them. They're working still through all the eye tracking processes of it. But digging through their research, they pulled up a bunch of information that's nowhere in our, say, genre of literature. It seems like there's being similar literature, especially in behavioral psychology and other issues. It's hard to wrap your mind around. It seems like there's people doing the exact same research, just in different areas. Do you have a good technique on how you inculcate all that together in one? It's kind of like there's people doing the exact same things in different fields that we could share the information from, but it's hard to do because it's so vast.
No, I agree completely. And that's what, you know, we have our silos of practice. And as a result of those silos, I think you're right. Very similar questions are being asked. And in some cases, people in one field have no idea of what people in another field are doing. So I think our best hope for that is maybe professional organizations, and as technology gets better, having more intelligent types of searches where we can cross over those kind of boundaries, because I think you're making a really good point. Maybe some wasted effort sometimes where people are trying to ask questions that have really already been answered. So really good point.
It would be interesting if there could be a meta-analysis done on that very topic. That's
right. Yeah, that would be good.
But I don't know who's going to volunteer for that.
Well, you know, it would have to be like a cross-functional team, which would be very interesting if you took a basic question and then you had people from different fields who could contribute their research. I certainly, you know, would not be literate in other kinds of fields like he was just mentioning. So you need a cross-functional team, I think, to do it.
That's right. We need about, what, 10 or 12 Ruth Clarks? So you can stand your ground on the instructional and learning side.
Right.
Then we'll have other people who might contribute. So we'll sign you up for that team, Ruth.
Thanks, Andrea.
Well, I had a question. Really, it's very much a practitioner's type question. In looking at the current programs that we use to design e-learning, for example, Storyline, Captivate, Lectora, which our students are very familiar with now after working with them, it seems to me, I personally would not know how to insert or design a character that had gestures. You know, the learning tools or the e-learning development tools, they have a whole library of characters with different poses. And so I guess what you could do is, you could go through quickly your slides and be on a timer and change the different poses. So it looks like the character is gesturing. Or I was thinking you could have a video character kind of explaining things pasted on your screen. But I was really kind of perplexed about that, and I'd love to hear your opinion and the people on the call's opinions about that too, if anybody was thinking about actual implementation of this research that Mayor had done.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Andrea, and I certainly have no expertise with any of these programming systems except for having looked over shoulders, and I did see, as you said, those libraries of characters, but how you actually manipulate those, I don't know, so I'm hoping somebody with us can help.
Well, I'm hoping so too. I know the class was kind of divided. Some of them had experience in some of these tools, and others, it was their first go at it. So anybody want to chime in about that? You have any ideas?
I have two. One is in my quantitative research class, actually, there were a few e-learning modules built in. And I could tell because of the e-learning construction background that I was working on simultaneously, that she had used those poses, Andrea, in the way that you described, where she had timed it and set it up so there was a transition, like a little fade, and the character her pointing and gesturing would change. And I actually was paying really close attention to when the learner had control over the pace, because what I find interesting about using a video is that, we've read a lot of studies about how the pace of the learning, especially depending on the learner's prior knowledge, if they're a novice or expert, it can really either impede or benefit the learning if they have control of that pace. So it's interesting to think about the practicality of using a video. They could, I guess, pause the video and go back. But the way that the e-learning that I just referenced, where it was a gesture and it was having those transitions built in, there were multiple, like you had to keep clicking continue. So it kind of had that pacing built in for it, which I think was very effective for me. And
you mean rather than the automatic transfer, Belen?
Yeah, so rather than having like a 30-second, entire piece, it was like 10 seconds with a gesture to, just so you could follow along at your own pace.
Or, it could do the whole, it could be timed, but it could act kind of like an animation in an e-learning program. So once it was done, you could go back and you could start it and stop it wherever you wanted. That's another application.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Thanks. That's helpful. Do you think when you did you take the learning, Belen, the e-learning?
Yes, I did.
Do you think that it, even though you didn't have anything, to use as a control, but how do you think it affected your learning with this gesturing?
I think it probably benefited. I think it would have been a greater benefit within the context. So because it was a statistics quantitative research class. It was a classroom board, and the gesturing was to different parts of the board. So it was more of an engagement feature, I think, rather than actually cueing the learner to look at this particular neurotransmitter, for example, like with Mayer's paper. I don't think it was necessarily as beneficial because of the content, because it was really more of like a lecture, and there was gesturing to the important, like the p-value, you know, so she would gesture to the p-value, and that's when you reject your null hypothesis. So I do think it was definitely more effective than if it was a static
Okay.
image. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ruth, I had a quick question here. Just in your experience and your time, all your experience in research, it seems like we're in human performance improvement, and it seems like to some degree this idea of having the instructor there on the line and everything, it goes back to that fundamental learning we learn as humans. You know, it's usually, hey, look at this flower, and they point to it, and you learn it that way. What would you say is the human element? You think, I mean, whether it's a voice, you know, giving encouragement, you know, as you pass the next slide, or do you think that's a critical part, that human element? And the more it's to how we learned as toddlers, that is what helps to build learning environments?
Well, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but certainly I think Rich Mayer's research on personalization really emphasizes that human element. For example, even if you're just using text, as you know, if you use I and you and we, you get much better learning compared to like a third person type of thing, which I think points to the fundamental cultural human engagement, which John Sweller would say, you know, was an evolutionary thing. As humans way back when, we have learned by modeling one another and by communicating interpersonally. I don't know if that's the direction of your question.
It is, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it just seems like the more we can replicate human interaction, it seems that, yeah, because of the personalization principle and other things, that's why I always vacillate back and forth. Is classroom instruction as effective as e-learning? You know, sometimes because of that human element. Now with virtual reality and animation things, we're able to get that pretty close to simultaneous now almost. There's not much, the fidelity is a lot higher than it used to be. So.
Right. Increasingly now, as you allude, we have a lot more tools in e-learning, and also things don't have to be exclusively e-learning. I mean, per se, you can also have just what we're doing now, or you can have, you know, asynchronous types of engagement with other learners. So we have so many more tools now, I think, to bring the human element in.
One note, Riley, just on that, is that what I liked, again, in the article is that they referenced, in terms of like the social cues, the cooperation principle, which is the implicit contract between the speaker and the listener in general human-to-human communication. So it's, again, those like behavioral things that are built into us. Another example is, I think they refer to it as the media equation, where people will accept a computer character in e-learning as a social partner if they fit those realistic human-like characteristics. So to your point, you know, the more we feel like we're actually talking to someone and engaging with someone and communicating, the more we buy in to the learning itself. And it probably motivates us as well, because it's this intrinsic, you know, again, contract between a speaker and a listener in communication. It's like almost like a dialogue. It's that interactivity that is so important in e-learning versus the learner being a more passive recipient.
And that's a really good point. And there was a study way back when that I read where they compared like different media types of learning and, you know, different environments. And the number one where the best learning, and this won't surprise anybody, was a one-on-one tutorial. A one-on-one tutorial, you know, with a human and a learner, because obviously you can dynamically adjust your tutorial and it's very personal. And perhaps if we extend that out to technology, then as we get into intelligent technology systems, we can come closer to that one-on-one experience.
Well, I agree with Valen's point. It's very, very spot on. But I guess then what Mayer said in the article, I believe, was that it didn't matter if it was a different kind of character doing the gestures. It could be an animal. It could be, you know, didn't have to be, you know, human looking or whatever. Didn't I read?
Yes, they've actually studied different types of things, and I think what he's come up with in terms of embodiment is that whatever little figure you use, there are some human-like features, such as, you know, the eyes,
Yeah.
and, you know, having some kind of little hands and things, and so you could use different things as long as they have, you know, some humanoid type of feature.
I see. Okay. Okay. And it looks like we're out of time. I have one last thing, if you indulge me, Ruth.
Sure.
What, you know, there were 5 things that Mayor mentioned in his, you know, what are the next steps, basically. Do you know what he's focusing on next in his research?
You know, that's such a good question. And I don't know, because I used to meet with him once a year at AERA, and I always take him out to dinner, and then I would ask him exactly that question, because as you know, by the time you read something in a publication, it's probably been at least a year probably since it was done. I do know he's probably very actively interested in games. And one of the things he told me was, you know, a lot of the research too is a function of what is funded. And what is funded right now a lot is STEM, you know, STEM learning, and then games, you know, people are very interested in that. So those would be my guesses, and I'm sure he's continuing with his multimedia principles to fill in those boundary conditions. It's a good question, though.
And then to kind of follow up too, what about what's next for Ruth Clark on the research spectrum?
Okay, so I'm probably going to continue. I don't see myself opening up any gray areas. I have been working on evidence-based games, and I have a class coming up on that in the fall, because Rich Mayer has a whole book on evidence-based games, and there's a lot of research out there. And I think we have sometimes been, you know, a little over-exaggerating. And it's like anything else. Is a game effective? Is a graphic effective? Well, the answer is it depends. So I'm trying to, you know, come up with under what situations would a game be an effective type of intervention.
Well, I hope that you find that a game could be an effective type intervention rather than our myth-busting learning styles hypothesis.
Yeah, actually, there's been 3 meta-analysis, which I thought was very interesting. All 3 came up with an average effect size improvement of about 0.3, which is not huge, but they were all positive and all around that direction. So I think the right kind of game in the right circumstances can be effective.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, and the audience has been quiet. So are we done with, can we let Ruth go?
Well, thank you so much, Ruth. It's past that time, and I really enjoyed the entire webinar and the exchange. It was excellent.
Thank you, guys. I'm very impressed with your questions and your participation.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks. Hope to talk to you soon.
You bet.